Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. In this podcast, PRI welcomes back an all-star panel of experts on all things digital to discuss regulatory changes to data privacy and cybersecurity during 2020 and what lies ahead in 2021. Panelists include Bartlett Cleland, Senior Fellow of Technology and Innovation at PRI, Dan Caprio, co-founder of the Providence Group, Jim Halpert, partner, DLA Piper, and Steve Del Bianco, Executive Director of NetChoice. The panel was hosted by PRI's Evan Harris. Thanks for joining us.
So this is our second panel. We had everyone on earlier in the year to talk about data privacy. So we'll have a nice recap of everything that was 2020 with data privacy, with cybersecurity, big tech, and we'll look at what's to come in 2021 with a new administration and maybe any federal or state laws. Just a quick reminder and some housekeeping. Pacific Research Institute, we're a nonpartisan free market think tank. We're based in California and we're led by Sally C. Pipes, who's our fearless president and CEO. If you like anything you hear or want to catch the recording afterwards, you can visit pacificresearch.org. So let's jump into panel introductions so you don't have to hear me and hear all these smart guys on the panel. So first up, we have Steve Del Bianco. Steve's the Executive Director of NetChoice. They're a coalition of online e-commerce business, including Google, Yahoo, Facebook, eBay. You might have heard of some of those or used them. Steve's well regarded for his expert testimony in Congress and legislatures across the states. Steve, thanks for joining us today. Next, we have Dan Caprio. Dan is co-founder of the Providence Group. Dan's internationally recognized expert on privacy and cybersecurity. Some of his more notable roles that I found notable and I picked, Chief of Staff for a Federal Trade Commission Commissioner and Chief Privacy Officer and Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Dan, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Evan.
Next, we have the great Jim Halpert, partner at DLA Piper. Jim has defended clients in front of the Federal Trade Commission investigations, played a key role in drafting federal privacy laws that you might have heard of called the Patriot Act, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and the Communications Decency Act. Jim, thanks for being here.
Thank you. And to be clear, I did not draft the overall Patriot Act. I drafted some sections of the Patriot Act. Yes. I'm not responsible for the intrusions on personal liberty. It was a matter of mitigating some issues, and Bartlett was there too.
That's a good clarification. Thank you.
Yes.
We won't hold you responsible. Last but not least, Bartlett Cleland. He's PRI's technology fellow, also senior advisor at Materey Bridge. Spent your whole career in technology and innovation. Also worked on Communications Decency Act, Internet Tax Fairness Act, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, to name a few. Bartlett, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right, let's jump in. Dan, we'll start with you. So this summer, European Union, the European Court of Justice, they ruled that the 4-year-old EU-US Privacy Shield framework, as most people know it, was invalid. They basically said the US does not have strong enough data protections that are up to GDPR standards. Could you maybe explain a little about the ruling and then what's next?
Sure, thanks, Evan. Happy to introduce this. So the Schrems II decisions, the latest and perhaps most significant event in a long-running series of issues regarding the appropriate role of surveillance in our society and the inevitable collision of surveillance and privacy. The decision in July invalidated the EU-US Privacy Shield, raised questions regarding the use of standard contractual clauses, created new obligations on data exporters, and at some level imposed certain obligation on data protection authorities. These findings have created vast uncertainty regarding transatlantic data flows, specifically, as well as data transfers from the EU to certain other countries more broadly. So we tend to think about this as just US-EU. Read broadly, this is basically the rest of the world. But for purposes of today, we're going to talk US. The uncertainty is only heightened by the fact that this is the second time that the ECJ has invalidated a transfer mechanism with the US. So ultimately, the Schrems II decision examined two issues in US law: the remedies available to Europeans for surveillance in the US and the scope of surveillance authority in the US. To understand the path forward, you got to kind of keep both of those in mind. So in invalidating safe harbor, I mean, it's significant because there were more than 5,300 companies that were transferring data through the safe harbor. Many of them being small business and SMEs. So not only to mention the trillions of dollars in transatlantic data flows, but the impact on SMEs has been significant. So for our discussion. It's important to note, and I think Jim wants, and everyone will and can jump in on every question, but I think this is a significant issue, and so the Trump administration, led by Jim Sullivan at Commerce, has spent a great deal of time with the European Commission trying to come up with a resolution. So both sides are hard at work. It's not easy. It's not something that a comprehensive privacy law is necessarily going to fix because of the national security issues. But it's important to note that we've been at this with the Europeans since the data directive in '95, but the creation of the safe harbor in 2000, which was invalidated by Schrems 1 and then the creation of Privacy Shield. So there's a strong transatlantic commitment to try to reach some resolution. It's just complicated by the European Court of Justice, and the choice was made really to look at surveillance and national security in the U.S. and not so much to focus on the information sharing and national security in the EU itself.
Got it. And Jim, you wanted to add on to this as well?
Dan's laid this out really nicely. I think the problem with this is that Europe is not, there's not one entity to negotiate with. And the European Court of Justice has inserted itself and now made the data protection authorities, whose job is just to think about privacy, they don't balance other interests, and made them, given them authority to stop data flows if they want to. So all of a sudden, their role is a lot bigger, and that complicates a multi-party negotiation. So the Privacy Shield and the Safe Harbor were negotiated between the European Commission and the US. So Jim Sullivan, who's doing an admirable job, is going over and negotiating with the European Commission, but the European Commission no longer has sole authority to strike a deal. And we also have seen some safeguards be announced about a month ago by the European Data Protection Board, which is a combination of the European Commission and these 27 data protection authorities. And they took a very, very restrictive view. In particular, these are proposed safeguards of transfers to the US. So any transfer to an entity that's subject to the Patriot Act in the US, Section 702, has to encrypt the data at all times when it's in the US, or pseudonymize it so it can't be identified. So this makes most forms of it, but not all forms of analytics, their particular homomorphic encryption workarounds that could be privileged by this, but makes them really suspect if they occur in the US. But there isn't, as a practical matter, risk for most of the data transfers in question. There is no U.S. surveillance request for, if you have an accounting firm or mainstream bank or whatever. There's just not a lot of stuff that's going to be happening here. And right now the draft from the European Commission suggests that the practical risk doesn't matter. It's just a formal legal risk if, in the abstract, this transfer happens to the U.S., that creates potential for violating EU privacy laws with potential enforcement actions and private lawsuits. It's really impractical and very formalistic. The understanding that I have from my European colleagues, is that the privacy data protection authorities were tired of Schrems going into the European Court of Justice with these lawsuits and overturning their solutions for international data transfers. And unlike the European Commission, these guys only think about privacy. So for them, they're thinking, why should we take this chance? And the European Court of Justice really mixed this up in some interesting ways. The other thing to think about, and Steve, I'll yield the floor to you in just a second, is that the European Court of Justice decision speaks to whether there's adequate redress for violations of privacy rights through mass surveillance. And their point is the European citizen may never know that they were the subject of large 702 programs, and they look at the U.S. system, and in particular looked at our standing doctrines, which generally the government likes a lot, which shows you have to have some concrete injury. And there's a case called Clapper, where the Supreme Court held that lawyers couldn't sue for speculative surveillance that the government was almost certainly conducting when they called their clients at Guantanamo. And so the European Court of Justice goes off on this and says there really is no way that you would have standing if you were subject to this kind of surveillance. And so what's hard about this, and I'd be curious, Dan, what your conversations with Jim have been on this score, is to find some form of redress. And we have Article 3 standing, which is used by the federal courts to dismiss a lot of claims. And we have to find some way around this. So I've been thinking with one of my partners who's a former Associate Solicitor General about how to frame this, but there will have to be some kind of action that people can bring with probably Congress or the executive branch creating a way for people to at least find out if they were targeted in surveillance. And then on that basis, they would have knowledge, be like a FOIA sort of action, and they could then be able to meet the standing requirement. But this is not in US law right now, and it's going to require some creativity, I think, to pass the European Court of Justice standard. Now, the European Commission and Data Protection Board could decide they want less than that, but for years, we've approached these questions like the Privacy Shield with no change in U.S. law at all, and this probably requires the Congress to go along. So probably will require Mitch McConnell to work with Nancy Pelosi on some little change to U.S. law that will satisfy this practical redress, and will also probably be criticized by the Ted Cruz's of the world as creating a different sort of standard for foreign data subjects than for U.S. data subjects. But it's kind of messy, and it also politically right now with the tensions between the Trump administration and the European Union on the military front and the trade front, Jim Sullivan, who's doing a really good job, has a very difficult hand, and it's going to require some real creativity and collaboration, I think, in a bipartisan way to reset this, and it will require some small gives on the part of the intel community who aren't used to having to do this. So it'll be, and they're working also, the absurdity of this is that they're helping intel services and law enforcement services in Europe a ton with these programs. So Europe is probably the main beneficiary of the surveillance of European data subjects, but the European Court of Justice looks at this in this abstract, weird frame, and none of that matters. So we have to move this, and we need real cooperation, and we need for, with COVID-19, we need for the government, the European Commission, the European Parliament to come up with their side of a deal and probably give U.S. citizens the same kind of rights. But it's going to require some creativity. It's going to be an interesting space to watch. Sorry, Steve, over to you.
Dan talks about guidance to the negotiators, and Jim giving advice to clients as well as to Congress reveals how impractical and expensive, and in many cases unworkable, these new European positions are taking. And that, coupled with the fact that, as Jim identifies, it's very difficult to identify the true risks that they're trying to solve. So I just like to boil it down, as the non-lawyer on this group, to the real motives that are at work here. Europe would love to see some European national champions in the technology space, e-commerce, and social media. So Fortress Europe is turning to a whole battery of regulatory, tax, antitrust investigation, privacy law, and without ever making it explicit, I think it's a subconscious bias that nearly anything that Europe can do to knock American companies sort of off their game is going to benefit the rise of European companies that have difficulty competing. So when you realize that that's the wind behind the sails here, it's almost as if no matter how good the work that Jim does or that Dan is doing, we are not likely to stop that wind behind those sails. And we're going to have a handful of competition with Europe. And the same thing is coming from China. So as W.C. Fields once said, it's time to grab that bull by the tail and see what's coming.
But in fairness, I think the European Court of Justice is interpreting GDPR. So GDPR may have to change to some extent. And getting that to happen in that political environment, Steve, is going to be very challenging. Also, right now, transfers to China, which has many fewer protections against surveillance, where you have absolutely no recourse, are not subject to any sort of restriction in Europe. That's coming, but right now, Russia, China, North Korea, you can send data all sorts of different places, but the U.S. is uniquely suspect based on these Schrems cases. And I think there's really a question whether this guy Maximilian Schrems, like the WikiLeaks folks, or where he's actually getting some of his money, because it definitely plays to the sort of disruptive Russian game of creating rivalries. But whatever it is, the European Court of Justice is looking at this in this very legalistic way, not a protectionist way. And but the way out of this is through the European Parliament, and that's those sorts of sentiments are very strong there, Steve, and that's part of our problem.
Jim, let's stick with you, and let's come to America. Believe it or not, the election has been certified, and now we know there'll be a Biden administration. That was actually, all the certifications were done earlier this week. What can we expect with the Biden administration coming in? Is there really going to be any movement on data privacy, big tech?
Well, first of all, I'd say we knew the answer to this about 10 days after the election, and this is the inevitable that's now happening. But the Biden administration, and I have no inside information, I supported him and, think he'll be a better president. I'll wave this so you guys can see that I am actually a Biden person. But I think on data privacy, I think we can expect to see the FTC be more aggressive, that we had a sort of politicization of the FCC role, where we saw, for example, Jessica Rich was a very, and David Vladeck also, he would sometimes say things that were expansions of the law, but they were very careful in what they did in their enforcement. And, it remains to be seen what will happen in a world where all of a sudden, the FCC has been hyper politicized for years, but the FTC became politicized over the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where a company was subject to a consent decree and then was violating it in a way that it was pretty clear it was a cost of doing business. And so that created a feeling among the privacy advocates and consumer advocates that the FTC was too weak. And I think we can expect the FTC to be, based on the votes of some of the commissioners who are there now, to be more aggressive on the enforcement side. And they were already pretty aggressive. So I don't, this may be a matter of degree. If there's a privacy bill, the FTC will almost certainly get enforcement authority for that privacy bill. And I think we could expect, if that happens under the Biden administration, for them to take that enforcement role pretty seriously. In terms of big tech specifically, we've already seen this investigation that the Trump Commission has announced. I think that will continue. And given that there was some, I think, politicization of, around sort of working the ref on social media that Steve will speak to shortly, I think that sort of influenced some of the Republicans on the FTC a little bit. But note that the chairman did not vote for that. It was a weird vote, but I think we can expect that to continue, and maybe continue with a Consumer Protection Bureau chief who is a little bit more aggressive. Where that leads, it's pretty broad. It includes Reddit, a bunch of other platforms. So I think it's not the usual just big tech investigation, but I think this also can tie into some of the antitrust investigations, which are ongoing. And so, data that's provided to the government can be used there. So it opens up a side of that investigation that also involves how data is being used, which is interesting. I think we could see a push toward more creative thinking on cybersecurity and how to better incentivize strong security through the supply chain. I think, we've seen some recent events that suggest that that's an issue. I think we can also expect to see stronger cybersecurity enforcement against foreign actors like the ransomware folks, look at more effective remedies and collaboration with allies in places like Europe to seize assets of these, which I think is very positive and good thing to do. I think we'll probably see a bigger emphasis on election security. Mitch McConnell held up funding for Electech. It's pretty clear that there's a lot of concern about election security and integrity. So I think we can expect to see something move there. I think we're also likely to see an examination of AI in a slightly more regulatory way. And there are certainly some potential harms there. I think we're also likely to see a real emphasis, and I think this will be really good, on making sure the U.S. is better represented in standard setting efforts where China, frankly, floods the zone and we're getting beat in terms of presence in those areas. I think we also may see an emphasis on economic development in public, university, public-private partnerships, economic development. That was a big theme that Karen Mills drove in the Obama administration. I could expect to see that. And generally an emphasis on innovation and trying to find good jobs. Clean tech is another one that will be, I think, a focus. But trying to find ways to improve the lot of Americans who are left behind in the drain of industrial jobs. And I think that will probably be Joe Biden's number one or number two goal, and that tech has a significant role to play in that. And the extent that jobs are also, building out more broadband to underserved communities. There are going to be a bunch of programs that Kathy McMorris Rogers has said she is interested in working with the administration on, and I think the administration is probably going to be pretty interested in working with her. So overall, I don't think that this is necessarily good or bad for technology, the tech sector. I think it may be a little bit better simply because I don't think we'll have the personal sort of whims of the president creating a lot of uncertainty for businesses. And if Republicans control the Senate, I don't think we'll see major change in the tax structure. So net, it could be better for businesses than the current environment.
Yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Thanks, Evan. I just wanted to pick up on 2 points, one on privacy and one on the FTC. So to build on what Jim said with respect to the incoming Biden administration, when it comes to privacy, executive branch leadership counts a lot. And this was not a priority for the Trump administration. They were AWOL, and so Congress can only do so much without the White House. So I think it's pretty clear that President-elect Biden, from his record, supports comprehensive privacy legislation, and there's been a lot of good work done on privacy in the Obama administration. I mean, we're not in exactly the same place as we were 4 years ago with privacy, but there's at least a good baseline, and I think having an engaged White House matters and can help move the ball. On the FTC, I would just add, I think the FTC has done a remarkably good job of trying to be apolitical. I mean, there are fundamental philosophical differences among the commission, but the FTC, in my estimation, has not been partisan, and they brought some big enforcement actions. The case against Facebook, the $5 billion penalty for violating the 2011 order is significant. That's changed that's not only changed the landscape for big tech, that's changed the landscape for every company in the U.S. And so it's elevated risk, because what that case did, or what the FTC's pled going forward, is personal liability, a lot of times extending to the CEO, and big civil penalties. And I know we're going to talk later about the Facebook antitrust case, but that's also an instance, that was a very peculiar instance where the chairman formed a majority with the 2 Democrat commissioners and the 2 Republicans dissented. So I think we're going to see a lot more activity from the FTC in privacy and consumer protection. Chairman Simon's, his background was in antitrust, and so his focus, and it matters to be chairman, his focus has been more on the competition side. I think a new chairman will be equally focused on competition and consumer protection, and I think that's going to make a huge difference in the way that the regulators perceive corporate interest.
Mm-hmm.
Evan, if I can tag on to Jim's comments as well,
Yeah.
Of which I appreciate, and I think they're right on, although, again, have no inside knowledge, and nor do I have a Biden water bottle for that matter. But I think there is a reflection, hopefully, that will take place of how to engage with the new administration that center-right folks will, I hope, embrace. And a lot specifically, I'm thinking of a couple things. Jim mentioned broadband. So I'm going to put that into a broader category of infrastructure, where I hope there is a lot of work going forward, because there certainly is a lot of work to be done if we're really going to realize a next generation or an American century in technology expansion in the way we live, not as a device in our pocket, but in the way we live. But particularly on broadband, the opportunity to craft nuanced, targeted solutions that are either public-private partnerships, voucherization of to give to citizens to be able to access broadband, et cetera. I think I have a real hope that not only the administration will embrace reasonable, targeted, nuanced approaches, but that the Republicans will meet them in that place, and that we can really advance broadband infrastructure in a way. The free market has done a phenomenal job, absolutely phenomenal job, but there are always going to be places where the market doesn't quite work. And I think we have a chance to solve that challenge in the next couple of years.
Yeah, there's one of the people who's been rumored as a potential FTC chair. That's his number one priority, and I think that's a win-win, and it's very important for rolling out true 5G, for example. There's a lot of innovation that can come from that. And Joe Biden has long been very committed to infrastructure, whether it be rail, whether it be R&D. He's very serious about that. And the question will be, as a matter of budget, is the Senate willing to go along with that? There's often newfound attention to the budget deficit when the Democrats take control of the White House, and it's going to be important that the tech sector speak up for spending that is targeted, that incentivizes good value add investments, and that spurs other economic growth. Because we've seen the budget deficit just completely balloon, and some of these infrastructure costs money. It can yield a lot of tax revenue over time, and that's going to be a challenge, I think, in terms of having a more multi-layered, realistic discussion of different types of government spending and what sort of tax breaks really make sense. And maybe there's some other ones for infrastructure that make a little more sense, but that becomes a discussion at the Finance Committee between a lot of different interest groups. And it's important that the tech sector think about R&D generally, which helps other sectors a lot too, but also what are going to be some investments that are really helpful. And in the case of broadband rollout, it's helpful that the telecommunications sector, which is partially the tech sector, will obviously be in favor of that too. So there'll be some allies there. But if we're in a what gets cut discussion as a precondition to this spending, it's going to require some real thought. Certainly the Democratic Party right now is very focused on cutting subsidies for carbon producing. There are massive subsidies in the budget right now for carbon producing energy sources. Is that something that Mitch McConnell will go along with? Given coal in Kentucky, these are going to be difficult negotiations, but it's important that we look forward as a nation to where, what is strategic as we're competing with China and other tech, emerging tech giants in Asia. We need to make sure that we are investing in what are going to be the industries of the future, or the R&D to support infrastructure to support them, instead of investing in the past, which is, I think, very much been the issue over the past 4 years.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. Thanks, everybody. Steve, let's move to you and talk about big tech. So last month, Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing with Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, CEOs of Facebook and Twitter. A lot of it was on how they approached the 2020 election and posts they decided to censor or remove, or how they labeled things. But some interesting notes that were brought up here too of some Republicans who have largely been against big tech actually signaled their support to allow them to self-regulate. And that's something Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg they've had that as a talking point for a long time. So, should Congress pursue big tech regulation or just leave it to the companies to do themselves?
Hey, thanks, Evan. It's a great setup. But take yourselves back 4 years ago today, in the immediate days after the 2016 shock election of Donald Trump. And you'll recall that the mainstream media and Democrats and maybe even quite a few Republicans were completely upset over the idea that foreign governments could use social media to spread misinformation or interfere in our elections, or that even domestic groups could use disinformation to stir up certain classes of voters or even suppress other classes of voters. So that drumbeat lasted for 4 years in anticipation of the 2020 election. And the social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, were on notice that they needed to put a lid on Russian disinformation, foreign interference in the election. So now 4 years later, you hear nothing at all about any foreign interference in our elections. So maybe, just maybe, that worked with respect to stopping foreign and fake accounts. But nonetheless, big tech, social media is still in the crosshairs, even more so right now in Congress. And when you think about it, the social media platforms are what enable all of us to share our own news and views domestically, leaving the foreign interference out. And Democrats firmly believe that social media needs to be more aggressive at moderating the posts that users make. And Republicans believe that social media needs to stop moderating and fact-checking the things that Republicans say. So these are diametrically opposed priorities and wishes. And yet some critics of tech will say, well, obviously there's a bipartisan agreement that we need to change the way social media moderates content. Well, that's about as far as the agreement goes, since the pursuit of any legislation is going to run headlong into the First Amendment, while the Republicans and Democrats continue to disagree because they have opposite aims on what content moderation is about. And that's because almost all of the speech that Republicans don't want to see moderated and the Democrats want to see moderated is protected speech under our nation's First Amendment. And in that regard, there isn't much Congress can do. So this notion of self-regulation, Evan, is a recognition of the reality. And the reality is the First Amendment doesn't let our government step in and stop hate speech. Hate speech isn't against the law. It's protected by the First Amendment. Disinformation is protected by the First Amendment. So we want these social media companies to do a more aggressive job, if you're a Democrat, more aggressive job of policing and flagging. The Republicans want to see less of it. And those two forces will tend to cancel. What are we likely to see? I would suggest we'd likely to see a greater amount of transparency required, as well as maybe some accountability for honoring their promises with respect to their community standards and content moderation guidelines. I think that would end up feeling like something was done while recognizing that the completely different motives here are not going to clash. Mm-hmm. So would Congress instead step in and simply repeal Section 230? Section 230 being the law that gives some limited liability protections to companies for the things that users post and say on their platforms. It also gives those same social media companies some protection from lawsuits for what they take down. So could the New York Post sue Twitter and Facebook for not allowing users to share widely the Hunter Biden laptop email scandal? Section 230 today protects Facebook and Twitter from lawsuits over those good faith decisions they made. But with Section 230 gone, the trial bar will have a heyday as social media gets sued for things that you and I say, and social media gets sued for taking down things that they believe are objectionable to their audience and objectionable to their advertisers. So I think that big tech has a lot of money. And what do they once say? That money doesn't necessarily buy you friends, but it does get you a new class of enemies. And that's certainly the case of big tech today.
That's a great point, Steve. Jim, you want to go ahead?
I'd also say that Europe is launching a digital services initiative that, it's unclear exactly where they're going to go, but that may move toward some pressure coming from Europe. And it will be interesting to see how that echoes here. And I could imagine Steve's transparency solution being really answering some of the questions on both the left and the right in good ways, and then we'll have to see what the input is from what's going on in Europe, if at all. Whether there are any ideas from there that flow into some kind of self-regulation or something like that here. But the Europeans are reaching out now, interestingly, and to the U.S., saying, "Hey, let's work together on a bunch of different fronts, and we want to collaborate." Given the protectionist wing of what's going on, this is the internationalist wing, and it'll be interesting to see if there's any collaboration. But these issues are so tough, and Steve, the left and the left and the right are just approaching this totally differently, and the result is probably no legislation, I think, because some of this is working the ref, I think, on both sides, and it's not really a basis for compromise if that's what you're doing. It's not really about legislation, so we'll see. Also, with Donald Trump not in the White House tweeting particular desires on this, we may also see folks like Lindsey Graham, who had to watch that flank, approaching this in a somewhat less reactive sort of way, which would be a good thing, I think, for having a reasonable solution that focuses, yes, on transparency to promote confidence, but also, in the end of the day, these are different platforms, have different markets. They've got an audience to play to, and that's going to drive as much of what goes on or more than what government's asking to do. But eventually, if you have too much misinformation about vaccine, public health, things like that, that's not a neighborhood that the average American wants to live in. And so there are pressures that platforms like Facebook have responded to get that stuff off. You don't want your platform to make people sicker or to be the basis. I mean, most entities don't. I mean, there are exceptions for horrible experiences for women getting basically sexually harassed. I mean, there's sort of common courtesy, and some of that comes into play and may be a helpful driver to resolve some of the concerns around activities that the government couldn't necessarily ban under the First Amendment. But I think we'll see more differentiation of different kinds of platforms, where there's some that are, more civil than others, and that may not be a bad thing too. Part of the tension, or when you have people with different tastes in the same platform and they get really offended by something that they see, and there may be more diffusion of content. We also have issues around violence and people planning violence, and there's going to be pressure, I think, on that, particularly if we have a domestic terrorist incident in administration that will have less patience for that. So watch that too in this space and see what kind of requests are for self-policing arise in the U.S.
Can we, Dan, let's jump to you, and then we'll move on to Bartlett because we're getting close on time. Go ahead, Dan.
Just real quick. Thanks, Evan. I wanted to make two comments. So the Digital Services Act, my understanding of what a lot of that's going to look like, and there's a lot of content moderation in that.
Yeah.
But the Europeans in GDPR have the fine for violating. So they're using antitrust level fines for violating GDPR. So lack of compliance with GDPR can be a fine of up to 4% of global revenue. My understanding of the new Digital Services Act is that they basically doubled that the way this is going to roll out. And so the hammer is going to be, potentially an 8 to 10% fine for of global revenue. That being said, I did want to go back, and the Europeans, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council did issue on December 2nd, a sort of an opportunity, or sort of a new agenda for global change. And I think, and I'm actually optimistic about that, because we need to be working the transatlantic relationship, particularly as it relates to China. We do have our differences, but we agree on a lot more than we disagree. So I think paying attention to, and obviously it's going to be honest conversations, but the hammer that they have is big financial penalties.
Agreed. Well, Barla, let's move to you so we can get everything in. Let's go to DOJ. So, U.S. Department of Justice, they're continuing to pursue an antitrust lawsuit against Google. Meanwhile, Federal Trade Commission is pursuing an antitrust against Facebook. Can you kind of give us what's behind these suits and kind of where they're at right now?
Sure. So I'm going to take a slightly different angle than maybe we've heard so far. I'll get to a more specific answer. But I first want to say what's behind this. Hayek spoke to years ago, and it's called the knowledge problem. And that knowledge problem manifests itself a great deal in antitrust actions, and that is that there is a belief, some kind of a priori understanding of what a market should look like, how many competitors, or what the results of a particular business transaction will be, or who should be involved in those transactions, or what products should be offered to whom, etc. But the fact of the matter is, most government officials have precisely zero understanding of business. That's not their fault. It's just not what they do day to day. But number two, virtually nobody, in fact, I'll just go ahead and say nobody. I don't think there's a big enough brain to process all that information and figure out how a particular industry or product or company should fit into the quilt of American industry. And so ultimately, what you need, and I've mentioned this many times before, often when I've written about FCC or FTC, is regulatory humility. And that, if you believe in the market at all, with a little bit of regulatory humility, you end up getting to freely made decisions with minimal interference, light touch from government, only acting where there's actual evidence of harm, not getting ahead of the situation. Now, that said, it's a huge ask. DC, not exactly known for humility, known for a lot of not humility. But that's where that's the fire, that's the energy behind these cases. And that said, a little more specifically, so in the Facebook case, Facebook has been effectively essentially accused of buying up companies, and that buying up those companies has limited the competitive marketplace. That is to say, as they buy up a company and add it to the Facebook umbrella, that company is no longer effectively or at all competing in the marketplace for those same eyeballs or that same amount of time, depending on one's theory here under antitrust. So the assertion is that, sometimes said, sometimes not said, is somehow this is hurting consumers. So, or they say, more broadly, no one benefits from this sort of activity. First, the people that come to mind are the people who sold the business in the first place to Facebook. I strongly suspect they are not too upset about the fact that Facebook bought their business. In fact, they are probably served very well. Not an uncommon exit strategy when starting a business to come up with a way that a larger competitor or any competitor would buy your company because of product. There's a whole thread of thinking here about how difficult it is to compete in the technology marketplace when you have only one product, one service. And that is, in fact, a lot of these cases where companies are being bought. It's fairly absurd to think today that a company with one product or one service could actually grow to be a size that it could sustain itself in a marketplace. It's highly unlikely, and is part of where the thinking on antitrust has gone awry. Where Google is concerned, the Google situation is about influencing consumers to use its services, which I find to be wholly humorous, because I would like to think that Google has enough smart people somewhere around their campus that they say, we should influence people to use our services because, after all, that's how we make money. So that one as well strikes me as a little odd. What you generally haven't heard, and I think what you generally won't hear, is that in any way that consumers have been harmed directly. There will be a lot of fancy theories. There'll be a lot of different steps you got to go through to get to where there's supposed harm. And what those will generally be, instead of an expression of harm, is an expression of desire, a desire by politicians mostly, but by gadflies, et cetera, to comment on how industry should look. I'll stop there. I think there's an even more insidious thing going on in the background. In fact, I'm not going to stop there. Actually, I'm going to say this. I think there's a more insidious thing going on in the background, and it is occluded by these arguments put up front. And what I think that is I think there is a real desire to completely broaden, widen, those words aren't big enough, antitrust, to cover any matter of government desire to interfere in industry. So if you look at the report that came out of the House on the supposedly wide-ranging antitrust violations in big tech, you'll find language that, so I've got the quote here, that the competition law needs to be imbued with new powers to safeguard not just consumers, which is what historically we have done, but also, quote, workers, entrepreneurs, independent businesses, open markets, a fair economy, and get this one, democratic ideals. I don't even know what half of those words mean in this context, but I know they're all gigantic words that have nothing to do with protecting consumers, citizens of the country. I think that's what's really going on here. How far that gets, I hope not far. It certainly plays to the populist streak running through Congress on both sides of the aisle. But I hope that it gets stopped. And if we're going to have antitrust policy for digital, for big tech, for whatever, I hope that it at least does this. I hope that it at least starts focusing on the fact that these industries are human capital and intellectual property based. They are not railroads. They are not oil being pumped out of the ground. They are not limited in that way. And so you can't go after them in that way as you could in the late 1800s through the 1900s, frankly.
Sure.
And so they make little sense. I'll stop there.
Dan, I'm going to go to you in a second. I just wanted to add, Bartlett, you said, people selling their company. Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, who founded Instagram, when they sold it in 2012, they sold it for $1 billion. So I'm sure they're feeling good about that.
Yeah, they weren't injured.
They were not hurt.
Not injury.
No. Dan, I'll go to you, and then we'll go to Jim for a quick look at CPRA, and then I want to get onto our round robin before we lose Bartlett.
Yeah, I just wanted just very quickly to build upon Bartlett's point. Daryl West at Brookings wrote a column a few weeks ago and so I'm tying this to the Facebook and Google cases, but that what this represented was the era of permissionless innovation is over. And I thought that was kind of a dramatic thing to say until our friend Adam Thayer, who's the one who's written all the books about permissionless innovation, agreed with Daryl. So I think that what we're seeing is, it's residual from the 2016 campaign, that the techlash is real. These cases, they were bound to be brought in this administration. And I think it's, we used to have a straight line, between the right and the left, now looks more like a horseshoe. And so I think this is bound to continue in a Biden administration. And unfortunately, Bartlett, I think I think we're long since past the era of regulatory humility.
It can be restored. I'm confident. I'm always an optimist. That's why I love innovation.
That's why we like you, Bartlett. All right, well, let's switch this up because I don't want to lose Bartlett. Let's do our round robin, and then we can end on Prop 24 in California. So Bartlett, why don't we go with you? So this round robin, for those in the audience, we're going to go through biggest winner, biggest loser, biggest surprise, and biggest change coming in 2020. And this is related to data privacy, big tech, cybersecurity. So Bartlett, we can start with you.
Sure. So biggest winner, there, I think a lot of folks in the running here, industry-wise, company-wise, but I think Disney Plus is going to be my pick, and that goes right back to our broadband discussion earlier. And I think the ability of the FCC and the broadband industry to rally to keep our systems going when the EU could not, and limited data, I think is fantastic during this pandemic, so that we can enjoy all these things we're talking about. That infrastructure piece had to hold solid, and it did. Biggest winner. Let's see, biggest loser. I'm going to go off script here and say sanity. And I probably don't need to give anyone an example. Think of the last time you looked at any number of social media posts, and I think you'll agree. Biggest surprise. I think my biggest surprise this year has been the reaction to the government efforts on the coronavirus on both sides of the aisle. One, I saw a lot of people very much fall in line when big government said, do this and do that, without critical thinking. So it's not that it was right or wrong, it was done without critical thought. That was surprising. On the other side, also without critical thought, the just rejection because government said to do this or do that, I thought was also stunning. I thought both were the worst of American impulses. And I hope it ends, frankly. And let's see, lastly, we've got biggest change. So this is my hope in 2021. How about that? I hope that, when we talked about this right before we started, I'm hoping that we can get back to the presumption of grace, get back to some of that regulatory humility in 2021. And I think if so, I think we'll see a lot of progress on the topics that we've talked about here, not least of which is a solution on individuals' privacy.
Those are great. Great. Steve, let's go with you next.
All right, now let's see. The biggest winner in 2020, which was a year of real loss of our regular way of life, would be all the Americans who went online to order a meal, buy our groceries, to stay connected with family and friends, to stay informed about the virus and health issues and about the elections, and to stay productive at work and at school. So we're the winners because tech delivered. Let's say the biggest loser in 2020 was America's world-leading tech industry, which took a lot of assaults from China and from Europe, as we discussed earlier, but now we're attacking it from within. So the biggest loser is America's big tech leadership. Biggest surprise to me, and it's relatively recent, was the rapid rise of new social media platforms. Parler, which is the conservative version of Twitter, or Rumble, conservative version of YouTube. Look, these things have driven themselves from 0 to tens of millions of active users, and I'm on both, and it's a very active place. And they did this despite all the hand-wringing over barriers to entry or network effects that would limit the ability for competition to happen in social media. So this comes right around to tie in with Bartlett's concern about the antitrust cases. And then finally, biggest change in 2021. These are dark and somewhat cynical predictions, but let's say Zoom will be sued for antitrust because they've delivered so well for us. And then, I hope this doesn't come, but I have a feeling maybe if Techlash moves into 2021 with a lot of momentum, maybe Americans will turn their back on tech because it gives lawmakers a perfect foil to go after, but maybe Americans will start to throw away their smartphones, read printed books on paper instead of online. Maybe we'll start to meet in person and head back into the office instead of meeting the way we are here today. Thanks, Evan.
Steve, those are great. And as a printed book reader, I somewhat hope for that as well. Jim, let's go to you next.
Actually, sorry, I think that the biggest change in 2020 was really remote work, Zoom, Teams, applications that allowed people to really continue to earn a living and to be educated, and also the pipes through which that service was delivered. Broadband became an even more essential mechanism. So if you think about technology, dependence on technology and on communications, fast communications infrastructure really became much more important in American life. Biggest loser, Steve's point about the techlash is real. I'd also argue that this has been a terrible year for cybersecurity. I do a lot of work, as does Dan, helping clients with cybersecurity problems. And the rise of ransomware, data ransom has been a major change for a lot of companies. We've now seen, major hacks of the likes of FireEye, Mandiant. This is a world where cybersecurity, not catastrophic, but really annoying and privacy intrusive cybersecurity incidents are increasing dramatically. And then in terms of privacy, this has been a year of loss in transatlantic cooperation and a rise in data localization in lots of parts of the world. So the interconnectedness that the internet economy had is starting to fade. The biggest surprise, I think that the rise of these new entrants this year, and Steve flagged a few of them, but there are some nimble companies that are working around some of these things. I think the degree of localization and sort of assertions of internet sovereignty as they affect data privacy were a major surprise. And the biggest change in 2021, remains to be told, but I think we're going to see a greater alignment between Europe and the US around some of these issues, which will be a plus. I think we're going to see and I'll talk about this in a minute, a major boost to do not track and technologies or do not sell and technologies that promote individual decisions not to share their data. And in cybersecurity, I think we're going to see more of a movement toward collaboration to jointly not only share information, but share good practices in order to fend off increased cybersecurity attacks.
Those are great. Dan, finish us off, and then we'll finish with Prop 24 in California.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks for the panel. So my big winner are regulators, and that's at the municipal, state, national, multilateral, multinational level. And the regulators are not always in concert, and because data has no border or borders, everyone is flexing their muscles. We've gamed this out, and we've seen that with the multitude of regulators that they all have an impact on business and decision makers, and they all pose a risk. For my biggest loser, I think that the digital economy writ large is the biggest loser of 2020. But my biggest surprise of 2020 is the convergence of data and sort of holistic issues. And so that includes privacy, cyber, data use, including AI, data flows, antitrust issues, all the digital economy issues. But the convergence with which those have come together has been amazing. And so it's surprising to me how intertwined all of those have become. And of course, those all have an impact on innovation, economic growth, and data protection. My biggest change, or my hope, and I mentioned this earlier, but it's the restoration of the transatlantic relationship. We have, and I mentioned, the December 2nd, the Europeans put out their version of a digital agenda, and it's ambitious, but I think we have so much more in common, with Europe, and the relationship is so important in terms of common values that we need to have those honest and frank discussions, because we're gonna need collaboration and cooperation, in the coming decade as it relates to China.
Those are great. I think Dan and Jim, we need to get you guys on a plane to Brussels to hash it out with the Europeans.
Yes, we do.
Yes, Dan, we should talk offline about that. I know you and Andy are talking. There's a lot to do there.
There's an awful.
Well, quickly, Jim, my last question was for you, and we're going to circle around, but maybe we can quickly look at Prop 24 in California, the California Privacy Rights Act. Maybe just give us a quick pro and con. I'll open it up for comments from Steve and Dan, and then we can sign off.
Great. So what's good about the CPRA is an extra year extension of the employee and B2B moratoria for most of the requirements. They really don't, the law doesn't make sense there. It's good to have an extra year to work those out with some replacement for it. A huge sleeper is an operationally significant exception to data deletion and data access rights for most types of unstructured data. And that means if you get an access request, you don't have to go through every email or weird, TIF formats you may have lying around. That's a big savings. Also, you don't have to call things that are not actual sales. The CCPA currently requires that. And there's somewhat greater flexibility for uses of non-cross-site advertising services and ad metrics so that they are not sales. There's also a big exemption for publicly available data that is really publicly available, like public LinkedIn profiles. So those are big pluses. The bad is that if you're a service provider, you have a lot more obligations. You have almost none under the CCPA. So if that's part of your business, you really need to look at this, and feel free to reach out. Happy to help you figure that out. There's also a new data correction right, like under GDPR, and also a new opt-out of both secondary uses and disclosures, sort of new uses and disclosures of sensitive data, which includes geolocation data and email contents, which are not considered sensitive in Europe. And also there's a choice. You're either going to have to put up a clunky do not sell icon or honor a do not sell automatic signal. And this could be, for 2022, the biggest change around privacy law. And there's also a data retention limit where you can only keep personal data for the purposes in your privacy notice. So you've got to really focus on your privacy notices. And there will also be data breach class action risk for email account credentials. Then there's the ugly. It is 55 pages of dense, sometimes repetitive and confusing text with no less than 8 or 9 significant operational issues kicked to a rulemaking, which won't be done until 2022. So there'll be quite a lot of work. I'd say it's about 40% additional work beyond what you did for CCPA. And there will be this new data protection authority, as Evan mentioned, with members that will be appointed by specific state leaders and may be quite political, and an economic incentive for the DPA to bring enforcement actions to build their budget.
Those are great. Steve, go ahead.
I would just like to quote what virtually every character and fan of the comedy series The Office says all the time. And that is, thank God for Jim Halpert. Because without Jim Halpert, I would honestly have no clue how to understand where the flaws are in multiple state laws. Jim's commenting on California, but he follows all the state laws and the federal and the European laws. So if his ability to identify the problems and to fix them, because many things that he identified as the good are because he fixed them. So Jim, thank God for Jim Halpert, and keep up the good work.
You're very kind.
So, Evan, I wanted to build upon what Jim said and sort of relate it to at the federal level. So, CCPA 2, the ballot initiative, and the working out of the good, the bad, and the ugly, that's going to have a significant impact on federal privacy legislation. And depending who wins the special elections in Georgia, whether you're, what the base bill looks like. But my hope, and partly from this conversation, is that as we finally get down to talking about in 2021 a comprehensive federal privacy bill, that we think more broadly about the digital economy. We've talked about social media. Right now, it feels to me like on the Hill, we're trying to solve the social media problem, and it's a significant challenge. But when it comes to privacy, we've got to take a step back and sort of think of where we want to be in 5 or 10 years in terms of the digital economy, in terms of innovation, economic growth. And so that means a privacy bill that looks, that has elements of accountability, of risk management, of data governance, that's beyond just the normal notice and choice and access. So I hope that as we work through the good, the bad, and the ugly in California, that we can take a step back and incorporate some of the broader issues that will help to continue our leadership in the global digital economy.
Great. Well, if we're all good, we'll sign off here. But thank you for our great panel staying on. I wanted to give us extra time, and we definitely hit it. But I thought it was great. And so Jim, Dan, Steve, Bartlett, wherever you are, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Evan. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks to our guests, Dan Caprio, Jim Halpert, Steve Del Bianco, Bartlett Cleland, and Evan Harris. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.